Hi everyone, let's go ahead and talk about water pollution. This is the second of two lectures for chapter 11. So hopefully you've had a chance to review the first lecture, which was all about water resource problems. So we talked about how there isn't a lot of whole fresh water on the planet, and the fresh water that we do have is mostly locked up in forms of ice and snow and glaciers and things. So the little bit of fresh water that we have is incredibly important to living things, right? We learned that all living things need water and rely on water. So this second lecture is going to focus on a little bit more about those pollutants that we have. So just because we have fresh water doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that fresh water is clean and what we call potable and able to drink. So what we're going to look at in this lecture is we're specifically going to talk about water pollutants. So we've talked about air pollutants before, and so just like we saw with air, water pollutants are any type of physical, biological, or chemical change in the quality of the water that can cause living organisms to be impacted. So it can be things living in the water itself, or it is not able to be used by other living things. So for example, for drinking in that case. So again, we call these things pollution. Some pollutants are actually natural. In the case of things like sediments, sediments washing into a body of water is sort of a natural process, but a lot of what we're going to be discussing is actually are actually man-made pollutants. So just like with air pollution, we have two types of sources for water pollution. We have point sources and non-point sources. Point sources are, once again, just like we saw with air pollutants, where you have a specific pipe, right? There's a pipe coming out of a factory and it is dumping pollutants into a river or a lake. That's a point source pollution. You have a sewer line, right? So sewer is coming out, sewer water is falling into a stream or a lake. That is a point source pollutant. Non-point source pollutants, again, have no specific location where they dump into a body of water. It's a collection of what we call runoff. So when you have rain that falls on anything, parking lots, surfaces, farm fields, golf courses, whatever it happens to be, that water will eventually pick up any pollutants that are on the ground and eventually wash them into that body of water. And we call those non-point source pollutants. So again, perfect example of point source pollution. That's a very distinguishable pipe. We know something's coming out of that pipe, so that would be a point source. So let's talk about the different categories of pollutants. We have biological pollutants, chemical pollutants, and physical pollutants. Let's start with the biological pollutants first. These are disease-causing bacteria and human waste products. So any type of pathogens, again, we call pathogens things that cause disease. So they can be in the form of bacteria, they can be in the form of viruses, they can be in the form of these small single-celled organisms called protists. So there's a whole group of sort of living things, but what they all have in common is they cause disease. So you have things like typhoid and cholera and dysentery, hepatitis, all kinds of things. So these types of diseases are entering the water are typically entering the water as a form of human waste. So when human waste or animal waste is directly discharged into a body of water that is then used for things like drinking and bathing, you have a problem of having biological pollutants in the water. I'm not going to talk about BOD, biological oxygen demand, so we can just sort of move on to that. I do want to talk a little bit about some types of pollutants. I'm trying to think if I want to come back to that or not. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead and then I'm going to work my way backwards. So give me just a minute and I will get back to discussing lakes and eutrophic lakes in just a minute. So the other category, so after human waste or animal waste getting washed into a body of water and potentially causing all types of diseases, we call that biological waste. The next category we have is chemical waste. So chemical waste can be a variety of different things. Chemical waste can include things like pesticides and herbicides and other industrial substances that make their way into our waterways. A lot of this has to do with pesticides and fertilizers that are applied on things like farms, golf courses, your lawn. If you use a lawn service company to come and spray your lawn to make it green, for example, you're spraying pesticides and potentially fertilizers. Those things, again, are big sources of non-point source pollution. So rain will come, whatever does not settle into the ground is going to actually get picked up and then carried into your local body of water. So we also see, in addition to those, what we're calling organic types of chemical pollutants, we also have inorganic chemical pollutants. So again, this is all in the category of chemistry. Organic simply means contains carbon. Inorganic is things like metals, salts, and acids. These things can sometimes be released when rocks sort of naturally weather away. So we have some of these things naturally occurring in our rock, but a lot of these things are actually released from industry. In particular, we know things like mercury, for example, are released from those coal-burning power plants. And we kind of talked about some of the problems with coal-burning power plants. In particular, we talked about the sulfuric acid that it produces in the form of acid rain, but another thing that's created is mercury, and that mercury then is being washed away into, again, our bodies of water, where it then sort of accumulates in the water and accumulates in fish in the water. For example, so you've probably sort of heard about mercury contamination. It's a fairly common thing. Eating lower on the food chain when it comes to fish is actually better because mercury is one of those substances that bioaccumulates in tissue. And what bioaccumulation means is the little fish in the water are eating the little tiny single-celled organisms in the water that have taken up that mercury into them. So they've got like a little tiny bit of mercury in them. But then the bigger fish eat the little fish and more mercury accumulates, and then the fish that are bigger than those eat those fish, and over time you have an awful lot of mercury hanging out in the tissues of these fish. So there's some really good guides. One's called the Right Bite guide. The Shedd Aquarium puts out a fish guide. If you are a person that eats a lot of fish, I would definitely have a look at the Right Bite guide. It gives you information about which fish are safe to eat from a mercury standpoint, and also which fish are safe to eat from the standpoint of good fishing practices. So I'm going to come back up now. So we've got these chemical pollutants, and one of the chemical pollutants we talked about was organics. We said that we had fertilizers and pesticides and things that are sort of put on the ground to help plants grow or to keep weeds from growing. A lot of those have nitrates and phosphates in them. And nitrates and phosphates are, again, an important element for lots of living things. Okay, you need them to make amino acids in your body, basically. And this is actually one of the things that plants need to grow as well. However, these plant nutrients, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And plants that have access to a lot of phosphates and nutrients grow very, very, very quickly. And this also applies to things living in the water, like algae. So in a regular lake, so in a lake that is clear and doesn't have a lot of algae in it, has just enough to actually meet the demands of the lake itself. Actually, that's not a good picture. We say that that those waters are, again, they're called oligotrophic, and I know oligotrophic looks like it's a bad thing, but it's actually a good thing. You like clear water, you have a little bit of algae, you have a good food chain that's working, the fish are happy, everybody's happy. Unfortunately, all of these organic materials, these nitrates and phosphates that are being washed into our waters, is causing something entirely else to happen, and it's actually causing something called eutrophication. And eutrophication is when human added nitrates and phosphates are being added to the water, and what happens is you get huge algae blooms. And if you've ever driven by a lake, usually it's in the summer, it's covered with green algae, it kind of has a stinky smell. This is a eutrophic lake. This is not a good lake. What happens is all of this algae is eventually going to die, and as it dies, bacteria comes and begins to break down the algae, because remember, bacteria are decomposers. In order to break down all this algae, they need oxygen, right? So they're sucking oxygen out of the water, causing fish kills. So fish can't survive in the water because there's not enough oxygen in the water, and so what happens is you get fish dying. So these lakes are stinky because you've got dying algae and dying fish, and they're no good. So eutrophic lakes is a problem, and something we see with, again, all of this excess nutrient pollution. Okay, so skipping ahead to physical pollutants of water. We have two types: sediment and thermal pollution. So sediment, again, is kind of a natural part of systems. You get runoff, and sometimes runoff will pick up sediment, which is just loose ground and loose soil, and it washes it into a body of water. It's a natural process. However, human activities are speeding this up, especially farming. When farms leave soils unattended and there's no plants to anchor that soil down, a big rain comes and it rushes a huge load of sediment into the water. That can be a problem because it's making the rivers more and more and more shallow, which is not good for living things. Last but not least is thermal pollution. So thermal pollution is caused by power plants. So power plants will use water to cool off their equipment. Even other industries do this as well. Equipment gets too hot. You take water out of the local river, you cool off all your equipment, and then you throw that water back into the river. Seems like it should be okay, right? We didn't do anything with it other than cool equipment down, but that water is much warmer now. And warm water doesn't hold as much oxygen as cold water does. And so therefore, you have less oxygen in the water. So again, here's what sediment pollution looks like. So you've got a construction zone here where lots of construction is occurring. Lots of loose soil, so all that loose soil is running right here into this big body of water. So some persistent challenges we have is, again, especially in developing countries, access to clean, potable drinking water. Potable means that I can access it and it's safe for me to drink. And it's a huge problem. We've got lots of different things that make water not safe to drink. Pathogens by far is the largest category, but there's lots of other things here as well. The biggest problem for developing countries is they don't have a sanitation system in place. So they are throwing their trash into their source of drinking water. They are throwing their waste, human waste, into their sources of drinking water. Animals are putting waste in that water, and then that's the same water they use to drink. And it's a huge problem because you are putting, especially children who are more susceptible to these types of diseases and are less able to survive some of these things. So drinking water is a really big challenge for lots of countries. But it's not just globally. Even here in the United States, drinking water is a challenge in the sense that our groundwater is at risk of contamination, specifically because of things like agricultural industry and even the industrial industry. So we have, even here in the US, problems with clean drinking water. So here's a nice picture that just kind of shows you where different sources of contamination of drinking water can come in for, especially for groundwater, what we're talking about. I'm going to skip ocean pollution. We just don't have enough time to talk about it. There's a whole host of different things troubling the oceans these days. You've seen pictures like this, oil spills, plastic fishing nets, all kinds of things harming wildlife. Here in the US, we're fortunate to have laws that say that our wastewater has to be treated. Our wastewater can be treated in a couple of different ways, but really what we have is most municipal treatment plants use 3 types of treatment: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So each type of treatment just does something a little bit different. Please make sure you look over and understand the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary treatment. I'll see if I can post a short video that kind of goes through what wastewater treatment plants do and how they are able to return water back to rivers that is, again, not necessarily safe enough to drink, but it's safe enough for the aquatic life that lives there. Alternatives, there's some interesting things here in your book, but again, we don't have time to talk about them. The Clean Water Act is, again, sort of the big overall arching piece of legislation that makes our surface waters clean enough, and they can be either clean enough for drinking or clean enough for recreational uses like boating and fishing and swimming. So there's different categories of things that the Clean Water Act does, but again, all incredibly important. So I'm going to sort of end things there. And again, I'll try to post another short little video that I can find which talks a little bit more about wastewater treatment.